beer, Si? One for me, one for me mate.
One for your mate, man, bugger.
Crocodile Dundee put Australia on the map. It was a cultural juggernaut that conquered Hollywood and turned a bushman into a global icon. But while audiences were laughing and quoting its most famous lines, there were darker truths lurking behind the legend. The real man who inspired Mick Dundee met a disturbing end. Some controversial scenes were quietly erased from history, and the franchise's legacy hides scandals the directors never wanted you to know about. This is the side of Crocodile Dundee that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew. The rise of Crocodile Dundee. When Crocodile Dundee first hit cinemas in 1986, it immediately redefined what an Australian story could look like on the world stage. A charming, rugged bushman in crocodile skin boots took Hollywood by storm, and for a brief moment, it felt like the whole planet wanted a piece of the outback. But what most people never figured out was that behind the legendary success and the lighthearted image of Mick Dundee, there were disturbing truths the film's makers never wanted the audience to know. Truths that, once exposed, would cast a shadow over the movie's gleaming legacy. The idea behind the Dundee myth came from the raw, brutal survival story of one man, Rod Ansell. In 1977, Ansell's boat capsized in a remote corner of the Northern Territory, leaving him stranded with no supplies, no communication, and no rescue in sight. For 56 agonizing days, he clung to life in the wild. His survival techniques bordered on the unbelievable, consuming whatever the harsh outback provided to stay alive, climbing trees to avoid crocodiles, and fashioning makeshift weapons just to see another sunrise. When he was finally discovered and rescued by Aboriginal stockmen who spotted him in the wilderness, Ansell emerged not as a broken man, but as a legend in the making. His ordeal immediately caught the attention of the press. Here was a man who had stared death in the eye and instead of retreating into anonymity, leaned into his wild persona. During television interviews, he refused to wear shoes, preferring bare feet even in city hotels. He slept on the floor of luxury suites rather than the beds provided. He lived by a code that seemed both eccentric and magnetic. And it was this eccentricity that caught the eye of Paul Hogan. In 1981, Ansell appeared on Parkinson, the British talk show. Sitting across from the host, he exuded a kind of rugged authenticity that immediately captivated Hogan. Watching Ansell, Hogan saw not just a man but a character, and within months he began sketching out the early drafts of what would become Crocodile Dundee. The wild survivor became the template for Mick Dundee, though Hogan would soften the edges, add some charm and humor, and give him a smile that could disarm even the toughest New Yorker. But Hollywood didn't want it. Studios dismissed Hogan's idea as too Australian and too provincial to resonate with global audiences. But instead of shelving it, Hogan took a gamble that would change his life. He funded the project himself, pulling in longtime collaborators Ken Shady and John Cornell to help shape the script. Together, they built a story that blended the mystique of the outback with the chaos of New York City, a fish-out-of-water comedy with a sharp, unlikely edge. The gamble paid off spectacularly. Shot partly in the sweeping landscapes of Australia and partly in the bustling streets of New York, Crocodile Dundee offered something unique. An outback folk hero navigating Manhattan with the same fearlessness he brought to Crocodile Country. Audiences couldn't get enough. The film grossed over $328 million worldwide, making it the highest-grossing Australian film ever produced. Practically overnight, Mick Dundee became a global icon, his catchphrases echoing across continents. The ripple effect went far beyond the box office. The movie ignited a pop culture frenzy in the United States, painting Australia as a land of rugged adventurers and exotic charm. Tourism skyrocketed. Hogan himself leaned into the role of ambassador, famously starring in the Australian tourism campaign with the line, "I'll slip an extra shrimp on the Barbie for you." That one phrase stuck in the American imagination and cemented Hogan's role as the face of Australia abroad. On the surface, the film launched a cultural phenomenon and forever changed how the world saw Australia. However, when you look closer, there's a darker layer. Because while audiences embraced the humor, The catchphrases of Mick Dundee, the real man who inspired it all, were unraveling, and yet Hollywood never wanted that truth to surface. Hollywood sanitized it. Crocodile Dundee didn't just tell an Australian story, it reshaped it, polished it, and in some cases, stripped it of its edges. Hollywood knew the film had something special, but executives weren't convinced international audiences would fully understand or even accept a version of Australia that was too raw and too real. So they stepped in, sanding down the details until the movie felt safe enough to travel across the world. What viewers ended up seeing was less Australia as it was, and more Australia as Hollywood imagined it. One of the first battles was over Paul Hogan's own voice. His accent, thick and unpolished, was exactly what gave Mick Dundee his authenticity. But American executives thought it was too strong, too strange, and too likely to confuse viewers. They suggested dubbing Hogan entirely, swapping his voice for a cleaner, more neutral sound. Hogan flatly refused. If there was going to be a Crocodile Dundee, it would have to sound like the man himself, thick accent and all. In the end, Hogan won that fight, but not without compromise. Instead of re-recording his lines, the film was split into two versions, a domestic cut for Australian audiences and an international cut for everyone else. The global release trimmed down the slang, softened some of the cultural references, and explained or removed moments that Hollywood believed wouldn't translate. For example, certain uniquely Australian phrases were swapped for plain English, making sure no one in Kansas or California got left behind. It was subtle, but the result was clear. The film was no longer just an Australian comedy. It was a carefully calibrated product designed to make Americans laugh without ever feeling left out. But the sanitizing went far deeper than language. The movie leaned heavily on familiar, almost cartoonish stereotypes of Australia. The rugged bushman who could charm anyone, the Sheilas, who were drawn to him, the ever-present kangaroos, and of course the crocodiles. These images were digestible, easy to market, and instantly recognizable. Yet they also reduced an entire country to a series of cliches. Real Australian life, with its diversity, its urban modernity, and its complexity, was pushed to the side in favor of a glossy postcard version. The most troubling omissions came in its handling of Indigenous culture. Legendary Aboriginal actor David Gulpilil was initially cast to bring depth and authenticity, but his role was sidelined until it was little more than a novelty appearance. Aboriginal traditions and ways of life were treated as background color, interesting enough to add flavor, but never given the respect or centrality they deserved. To many critics, it felt like Hollywood had taken something real and flattened it into a gimmick. Instead of using its platform to shine a light on Indigenous stories, the film played them off as exotic props in Mick Dundee's larger-than-life adventure. The portrayal of masculinity also revealed how carefully the film had been tailored for American audiences. Mick Dundee was not just rugged, he was positioned as a kind of throwback hero. He was fearless, funny, endlessly capable, and always in control. His treatment of women, while presented as cheeky or charming, was rooted in attitudes that even at the time were beginning to feel outdated. Hollywood packaged him as a man's man, the sort of character that could be easily marketed alongside cowboys and action stars. It worked, but it also meant that more complicated or nuanced portrayals of gender and race were glossed over. By the time Crocodile Dundee hit U.S. theaters, it wasn't just an Australian comedy anymore. It had become an export, an idea of Australia shaped to fit international tastes. It was clean, funny, and safe. But the truth beneath it, the rawness of Rod Ansell's real ordeal, the diversity of modern Australia, and the depth of Indigenous culture had been scrubbed away. Of course, the polishing came at a price. What audiences saw was a version of Australia that many locals barely recognized, a sanitized fantasy designed to sell tickets. And while the world embraced the film, the cost of that sanitization would echo long after the credits rolled. And as if that weren't enough, things behind the camera weren't nearly as smooth as the polished film suggested. Because while the audience enjoyed the end result, the people making it were dealing with a very different kind of struggle. The chaos behind the scenes. On screen, Crocodile Dundee looked effortless. But what audiences didn't see was the sheer unpredictability of life behind the cameras. The production wasn't a smooth Hollywood machine. It was a chaotic blend of wilderness hazards, improvised brilliance, and very human entanglements that sometimes pushed the crew to their limits. One of the earliest reminders that they weren't filming on a studio backlot came in the form of an uninvited guest, a real crocodile. Deep in the Northern Territory, where nature has its own rules, a massive croc wandered dangerously close to the crew. Even for a film built around Australia's deadliest predator, this wasn't part of the script. Cast and crew scrambled to secure the area, and production ground to a halt until wildlife experts could coax the creature back into the water. This was an almost poetic brush with reality, though nobody on set was laughing at the time. The risks didn't stop there. One crew member suffered a venomous snake bite during filming, an incident so serious they had to be airlifted out for emergency care. It was a sobering reminder of the dangers lurking just off camera. While audiences later laughed at Mick Dundee wrestling reptiles and strolling barefoot through the bush, the people making the movie were confronting threats every bit as real and far more terrifying. Even the stars weren't spared from discomfort. Linda Kozlowski, cast as journalist Sue Charlton, endured conditions that pushed her far out of her comfort zone. Instead of luxury trailers or polished hotels, she was housed in a tin shack with no plumbing. Nights were long, humid, and swarming with insects, but the experience gave her a sense of immersion that carried over into her performance. When she looked wide-eyed at the outback on screen, part of that awe and exhaustion was genuine. Paul Hogan, too, had his quirks that complicated production. When the wardrobe suggested replacing his old, battered crocodile skin hat with something fresher, Hogan refused outright. That hat wasn't just a prop to him. It was a piece of Mick Dundee's soul. Costume designers were forced to painstakingly replicate the worn-down look for backup versions, ensuring that Hogan always had his original hat on hand, even if disaster struck. For Hogan, authenticity trumped convenience, no matter how much trouble it caused the department trying to keep continuity intact. Ironically, some of the film's most iconic moments came from spur-of-the-moment improvisation. The legendary "That's not a knife, that's a knife" line wasn't originally scripted in the exact form audiences know today. Hogan played with the delivery, sharpening it until it landed just right. The unscripted energy gave the film its charm, blurring the line between actor and character. Other small touches, like wry glances and sly remarks, came from Hogan's instinct rather than the script. These improvisations, born out of chaotic shooting days and loose direction, ended up becoming the heartbeat of the film. There was also the off-screen romance that no one had planned for. Hogan and Linda Kozlowski's chemistry didn't stop when the cameras turned off. As the shoot went on, their bond grew stronger, sparking a relationship that became one of the biggest stories surrounding the film. They eventually married, adding a fairy tale twist to the movie's legacy. Yet, like many Hollywood romances, it didn't last forever. Their later divorce was a reminder that what looked magical on screen often carried much heavier baggage behind it. But the chaos of crocodiles, snakes, and romance was only part of the story. What came next would prove far more uncomfortable. Because while the world laughed at the adventures of Mick Dundee, there were scenes and choices that the directors worked hard to keep hidden. The scenes they tried to bury. Crocodile Dundee was hailed as a feel-good comedy that bridged two cultures, the rugged Australian outback and the bustling streets of New York City. It charmed audiences with its humor, heart, and charm. Yet buried beneath the laughs were moments that, even at the time, raised eyebrows. Decades later, those same moments would become the subject of fierce debate, forcing both fans and studios to reckon with the uncomfortable parts of a movie once celebrated as harmless fun. One of the most talked-about scenes came during a bar sequence where Mick Dundee encounters a transgender woman. Instead of playing it with curiosity or respect, the script pushed the humor in a direction that hasn't aged well. Mick behaves inappropriately, the gag relying entirely on the shock factor of her gender identity. In the 1980s, mainstream audiences might have laughed. However, today, that moment feels jarring. A punchline at the expense of a marginalized group. It's one of those scenes that modern viewers often stumble on, unable to reconcile it with the otherwise lighthearted spirit of the movie. The film also included racially insensitive exchanges, such as Mick's banter with a black chauffeur in New York. The dialogue leaned on stereotypes rather than authentic interaction, reducing the character to a prop for Dundee's antics. While audiences at the time may have glossed over it, critics looking back have noted how easily it could have been written differently without stripping away the humor. These small choices reflect the blind spots of the era, moments that revealed just how narrow the cultural lens was when the movie was made. Over time, these scenes became points of tension between nostalgia and progress. Paramount, recognizing the shifting cultural landscape, began requesting edits for broadcast versions and later DVD releases. Even Paul Hogan himself admitted that the bar scene had crossed a line. This acknowledgement signaled that even the film's creator understood how some of the humor no longer fit the times. In 2025, the controversy flared up again with the release of the so-called Encore Cut, a cleaned-up version of Crocodile Dundee for modern streaming platforms. Both the bar scene and the chauffeur exchange were removed entirely. UK broadcasters followed suit, airing the movie with similar edits during primetime slots. What was once brushed aside as edgy comedy was now being actively erased from the film's legacy. But the edits created a new problem. Some fans accused studios of bowing to woke censorship, arguing that classics should remain untouched, flaws and all. They saw the cuts as an attempt to rewrite history, stripping away the rawness that made Crocodile Dundee what it was. Others defended the decision, saying the edits made the film more inclusive and accessible to modern audiences, especially younger viewers discovering it for the first time. The debate quickly spilled onto social media, where the question wasn't just about one film, but about how society should handle the problematic parts of its cultural past. Film historians weighed in too. Some argued that removing these scenes risked flattening history, presenting a sanitized version of the 1980s that never really existed. They stressed that movies are cultural artifacts and erasing their flaws only makes it harder to understand the attitudes and blind spots of the time. Others countered that context matters, especially because what may have been acceptable in 1986 could cause genuine harm today, in an era where representation on screen carries so much weight. To them, edits weren't about rewriting history, but about refusing to perpetuate harm in the present. For longtime fans of Crocodile Dundee, the edits also sparked personal reflection. Many fans recalled laughing at the scenes when they were younger, only to feel uncomfortable re-watching them decades later. The discomfort wasn't just about the jokes themselves, but about realizing how normalized that kind of humor once was. In a way, the edits forced viewers to confront how much society has changed and how much it still struggles with issues of gender, race, and respect. Studios found themselves in an impossible position: leave the film untouched and risk alienating modern audiences, edit it, and face accusations of censorship. Either choice would stir controversy. Yet one thing was clear: the days when Crocodile Dundee could be viewed as a simple, carefree comedy were gone. Its legacy now carries layers of complexity, tied not just to its box office success, but also to the uncomfortable truths hidden within its frames. But Crocodile Dundee was never intended to be provocative. It was meant to be funny, charming, and universal. But comedy ages faster than almost any other genre, and what drew laughs in one decade can spark outrage in another. And while the debate rages on about whether these edits represent sensitivity or erasure, the controversial scenes have reshaped how people remember and talk about the movie. But this was not the only part of the film's legacy that studios would rather you forget. Beyond the edits and debates, the franchise itself would take a darker turn, stretching into sequels, commercial tie-ins, and a string of decisions that revealed just how deeply the name Crocodile Dundee was exploited, until it no longer resembled the original magic at all. Decline of the franchise. The success of the first Crocodile Dundee was so overwhelming that a sequel was inevitable. In 1988, Crocodile Dundee 2 hit theaters, carrying with it sky-high expectations. On paper, it was another triumph, raking in around $239 million worldwide. But while the box office looked strong, audiences and critics alike felt something was missing. The humor felt recycled, the charm thinner, and the story more forced. What had once been a fresh cultural phenomenon now looked like a formula stretched too far. By the time Crocodile Dundee in Los Angeles arrived in 2001, the magic had all but evaporated. The film grossed only about $39 million globally, a far cry from the juggernaut status of its predecessors. Critics were brutal, calling it dated, unnecessary, and little more than an exercise in cashing in on nostalgia. What had once defined Australian cinema on the world stage was reduced to a tired echo of its original spark. This decline wasn't just about poor sequels. It was also tied to the way the franchise was handled behind the scenes. Many accused it of becoming a brand rather than a story, with each new installment serving less as a creative continuation and more as a financial opportunity. The sharp wit and cultural authenticity that made the first film resonate were drowned out by half-hearted storytelling and predictable gags. Meanwhile, the man whose real-life ordeal had inspired the character, Rod Ansell, watched the global phenomenon unfold without seeing much of its reward. Ansell, who had famously survived 56 days in the remote Northern Territory, sleeping in trees to avoid crocodiles, was reportedly left bitter. He received neither royalties nor official credit for inspiring the character, even though his survival story was at the heart of the mythos. While Hogan, Shady, and Cornell reaped the success, Ansell lived largely outside of the limelight, his contribution overshadowed by the machine of Hollywood. Years later, when the brand was dusted off for the 2018 Super Bowl, it wasn't for a true sequel at all, but rather a marketing stunt. The high-profile commercial featuring Chris Hemsworth, Margot Robbie, and Danny McBride teased a supposed reboot before revealing itself to be a tourism campaign for Australia. It generated laughs and an impressive wave of online attention, but it underscored what the Crocodile Dundee name had become, a nostalgic punchline. And while the franchise limped on, the man at the heart of its inspiration faced a downfall far more tragic than the movies ever revealed. The true story of Rod Ansell's final years was darker than anything Hollywood dared to put on screen. The tragic fall of Rod Ansell. The story of Rod Ansell is perhaps the darkest shadow cast over the legacy of Crocodile Dundee. While the world laughed and cheered at the adventures of Mick Dundee, the man whose survival ordeal had sparked the entire phenomenon was slowly unraveling, far from the spotlight. His life, which began with such resilience and grit, ended in tragedy so unsettling, it stands in stark contrast to the heroic image Hollywood created. After his brush with fame in the late 1970s and early 80s, Ansell never embraced celebrity life. He turned his back on the city lights and retreated to the Northern Territory. With his wife, Joanne Van Os, and their 2 young sons, their life was rugged but fulfilling, grounded in the bush where Ansell had always felt at home. To many, it seemed like a natural continuation of the man's survivalist spirit. A figure who had stared down crocodiles and endured weeks alone in the wild would naturally prefer the solitude of the outback to the attention of talk shows and flashing cameras. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. In the late 1980s, Ansell suffered a devastating financial blow when the government's bovine tuberculosis eradication campaign wiped out his cattle herd. Nearly 3,000 head of cattle were destroyed, with little in the way of compensation. Ansell had built his livelihood in one of the harshest landscapes on Earth, and the loss was more than economic. It cut at his identity, leaving him with anger, disillusionment, and a growing sense of betrayal. By 1992, his marriage to Joanne had collapsed. The split left him adrift, with his sons living primarily with their mother. Ansell reportedly became restless and bitter, struggling to find a steady footing. What began as minor dealings in illicit substances soon grew into a riskier lifestyle. Ansell turned to selling larger quantities, and in time, his substance use escalated. He developed a heavy addiction to various substances, a dependency that would accelerate his mental decline. As the years went by, Ansell's paranoia deepened. He was once admired for his eccentricities, including sleeping barefoot on hotel floors, refusing to wear shoes on talk shows, and keeping his bushman identity alive even in the city. Yet he began sliding into full-blown delusion. He convinced himself that shadowy figures were watching him. He believed the Freemasons were plotting against him, that they were controlling the government and trying to destroy his life. Insider reports described him as increasingly volatile, unpredictable, and consumed by conspiratorial thinking. This paranoia reached its breaking point in 1999, On the night of August 3rd, police received reports of erratic behavior and possible threats in the Darwin River area, where Ansell had been living in a makeshift camp. When officers arrived, they encountered a man who was not the bush legend admired for his grit, but someone lost to substance-induced frenzy and paranoia. In a tragic turn, Ansell's erratic state led to a violent confrontation with police. Amid the chaos, an officer lost his life, and the standoff ended with Ansell being fatally shot at the age of 44. The grim irony of his death was not lost on those who remembered the Crocodile Dundee phenomenon. The man who had once symbolized survival, resilience, and a uniquely Australian kind of toughness had died in a haze of illicit substances, fear, and violence. The contrast between the heroic, almost mythical Mick Dundee and the tormented, broken Rod Ansell could not have been sharper. For Australia, his death was a tragedy, and for Hollywood, it was an inconvenient footnote. The machine that had commodified his survival story into one of the most successful films of the 1980s had long since moved on. Ansell's name rarely appeared in official retellings of the Dundee legacy. His struggles with poverty, addiction, and paranoia were far removed from the glossy tourism campaigns and nostalgic marketing stunts that kept the brand alive. Yet, to understand the full story of Crocodile Dundee, one cannot ignore the man behind the myth. Rod Ansell was not Mick Dundee. He was a complex figure, brave, eccentric, flawed, and ultimately consumed by forces beyond his control. His fall shed light on the darker side of fame, the way inspiration can be taken, polished, and sold to the world, while the human being at its core is left behind. When the credits rolled on Crocodile Dundee, audiences saw a tale of triumph, humor, and romance. What they didn't see was the survivor whose ordeal birthed the legend, the man who outwitted crocodiles in the wild and who later descended into a spiral of loss and paranoia. His tragic end remains one of the most disturbing truths the directors and Hollywood at large would rather leave buried. And perhaps that is the cruelest contrast of all. The legend endured, but the man was forgotten. What do you think? Did Rod Ansell deserve better? Let us know what you think in the comments below. And if you love juicy deep dives into celebrity lives, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon so you never miss a new video.